Hi and welcome to Wahlberg's APUSH. I'm Mr. Wahlberg. Today we begin our first unit, and in our class we combine the first two periods of Advanced Placement's curriculum into one unit. We're going to combine period 1, which is essentially what is Native America and the first contact with Europeans, as well as colonization of period 2, where the old world of Europe gets its foot firmly entrenched into American business. We combine those two because the stories really intertwine with each other, and I think you'll find that it's a more seamless way of understanding this era of American history. Today we're going to focus on episode 1, Pre-Columbian America, and we have two objectives. First, you should be able to describe the patterns of Native American life in North America before Europeans arrived. Now, this is a huge topic, and it's a major objective, and it's really more than we're going to be able to do in this video. It's truly a lifetime's worth of study. But I hope to be able to give you a model of sort of the spatial organization of Native America, how people in certain parts of the country lived and people in other parts of the countryside lived, and how those geographic pieces affected their cultures. Second, you should be able to explain how Indian and European ideas of freedom differed on the eve of contact. And with this, you're going to get a little bit of taste of our textbook author. We use the textbook Give Me Liberty by what is, in my opinion, one of the greatest historians working in the United States today, a professor at Columbia University named Eric Foner. Now, in this text, you're going to find that Dr. Foner's recurring theme is this question of freedom. The book is called Give Me Liberty, and we're going to explore what liberty means, how it's been interpreted over time, how that changing model of freedom comes to us as our country matures and grows. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 1. The first people to live in the Western Hemisphere were probably tribal migrants from Asia, and they probably followed animal herds over a land bridge over the sea about 15,000 years ago, when the last ice age had created a 100-mile wide land bridge connecting Siberia and Alaska. Now, we don't have any written record of this, so we're putting it together with anthropological data and pretty good understandings of it, but there are competing views. However, this is the mainstream approach in anthropological study, and it's the study that if you're asked about it by the College Board, this is what they'll expect you to know. Glacial melting then submerged the land bridge beneath the Bering Strait. When I was younger, I thought maybe the migrants came over an ice bridge during the Ice Age that had just frozen up part of the ocean, and they just walked across it following herds or chasing new food, or maybe just the old spirit of adventure. But I don't think that's probably the way you think about it. Instead, the Ice Age froze the oceans and lowered the ocean levels because more of it was taken up in ice. When the migrants crossed between what was Siberia and what was Alaska, they didn't know they were crossing continents because they weren't. It was land the whole way across. When glacial melting came and those glaciers melted back into the ocean, ocean levels rose and submerged that land bridge for 300 generations. Now, mainstream anthropologists agree that there was probably a second wave of migrants, the ancestors of who would become the Navajo and the Apache people, where they crossed the Bering Strait in boats about 8,000 years ago. There's some data that suggests a third migration about 5,000 years ago, that brought the ancestors of the Aleut and the Inuit people, sometimes called the Eskimos, to North America. For centuries, Native Americans were hunters and gatherers, or perhaps it's better to say gatherers and hunters, because foraging food traditionally made up the largest piece of that style of diet. They migrated southward in a southward direction, establishing thriving settlements in central Mexico and the Andes Mountains. There was a second wave of migrants that crossed the western mountain ranges and moved into the Mississippi Valley and the eastern woodland regions of North America as well. And sometime around the year 6000 BC, plus or minus, many societies developed based on high-calorie foods like corn and potatoes and squash. It made it easier to sustain life, and calorie-dense foods are really important in an early person's diet. And around that time, you also see the development of agricultural surplus. Agricultural surplus is really the key to establishing what I think we would call today as civilizations. It led to populous, urbanized, and wealthy societies in Mexico, in Peru, and in the Mississippi Valley. North and South American societies built roads, built trade networks, and built irrigation systems. They did lack the technologies that Europeans had mastered, things like metal tools and scientific knowledge that was necessary for long-distance navigation. And no Native Americans north of Mexico were literate. There was no written languages in what we think of today as the United States. But I don't want to make it sound like these people were primitive. If you have the technology, if you have the ability to build roads and trade networks and irrigation systems, you're not talking about a primitive people. You're talking about a pretty sophisticated civilization. Subpoint B. Although Native American civilizations in North America did not grow to the size of the Aztec and the Inca empires, the adoption of agriculture based on maize, based on corn, nevertheless contributed to an increased urbanization and more sophisticated social structures by sometime around the year 1000 AD. We see in the Mississippi Valley, the city of Cahokia, I don't actually know how to say that word, Cahokia is what I'm going to go with its population of about 10,000 people. It developed into the administrative and religious center of the region with nearly 30,000 inhabitants. Cahokia today is near St. Louis, and it was kind of like the heart of the Mississippi Valley civilizations. And there we find 120 of these mounds, these piles of dirt, that functioned as burial grounds, as the bases of ceremonial buildings, or of the homes of rulers. But by 1350, more or less, conditions like overpopulation and environmental factors and just the inevitable warfare of human contact led to the decline of the Mississippi Valley and civilizations. Still, their institutions and their practices would endure for centuries along the river, and their influence would reach as far east even as the Carolinas and the Floridas. In subpoint C, let us turn our eyes westward and go meet the Native Americans in the American Southwest and also the American Northwest. We'll begin in the Southwest with subpoint C, number 1. The Hopi and the Zuni ancestors went to go settle around what's present-day Arizona and New Mexico. There they built planned towns and multiple family dwellings. They traded with people as far away as the Mississippi Valley and central Mexico. There, people used irrigation to grow crops by somewhere around the year 1000 AD, and they were living in architecturally distinct multi-room structures, what we might call today as like apartment complexes, but they were called pueblos, built into the steep cliffs. Take, for instance, the Anasazi, who built several small and large villages in and around Chaco Canyon, and then connected those villages through a vast network of roads. Of course, networking roads and connections and long-distance trade is implying a very sophisticated level of cultural development. Drought, though, ultimately brought on soil exhaustion and the collapse of the Chaco Canyon settlements and other large settlements somewhere around the year 1150. And then people dispersed into smaller settlements, leaving city life to go into smaller villages. Now let's look northward to the Pacific Northwest, where hundreds of distinct Indian groups lived primarily by fishing and gathering, or perhaps we should say gathering and fishing, because gathering always ends up getting like a larger portion of the caloric intake than animals do. But really, the amount of ethnic diversity found in the Pacific Northwest by Native Americans, I mean, it would have been just absolutely fascinating. The Chinooks, the Costalicias, the Halitas, the Tlinglets, they were easily distinguished by their colorful totem poles and their uses of longhouses. If you imagine what Native American dwellings were all, say, teepees, it's time to broaden your understanding of the way that Native Americans lived in different parts of the country. Take, for instance, the Pacific Northwest, a longhouse. A wooden permanent structure was built, and they were long houses, thus the name. But these groups emerged as the most powerful nations in the Pacific Northwest, owing to their warrior culture, their use of 60-foot long dugout canoes, and their superior fishing capabilities. Subpoint D, let's move to the eastern side of the country, where we find Indian tribes living in the eastern part of North America who were sustaining themselves with a diet of corn and squash and beans, all supplemented by fishing and hunting, so some really high-calorie agriculture, and then fishing and hunting to go and supplement that along with it. The tribes here included, essentially, now we're going to group broadly into the Algonquin and the Iroquoian tribes. And there's like a lot of different tribes that are Algonquin and a lot of different tribes that are considered Iroquois. The division is really in their language family, as anthropologists have tried to make some categorical sense of all of the tremendous amount of ethnic diversity that's found there. It's language groups that end up becoming the defining way that people can deal and understand the relationship. So the tribes, including the Algonquin speakers and the Iroquoian speakers, they to the north shared several language and lifestyle traits. They lived in these semi-permanent villages where women were the primary farmers. They also participated in community affairs, while men were out warring and hunting and fishing. Societies there frequently warred with each other. This is not a peaceful part of the world. This is one that sits in a very uneasy tension that sometimes sparks into war. However, by the 15th century, by about the time that Europeans started arriving into the storyline, there were leagues and confederations and loose alliances that was holding together an uneasy, mostly peace. Instead of chiefs, there were these councils of sachems or leaders that held political power, and it was the council that made the decisions. Men were the leaders and the diplomats and the warriors, but it was a matriarchal society, which means that women also had important influences on council decisions. After the arrival of Europeans, some Iroquoians went and became Christians, including in them the first Native American saint, Kateri Tekakwitha, who's pretty important around my part. The sheer diversity of Native Americans seen by Europeans on their arrival was totally remarkable. The Indians, though, for their part, didn't see themselves as a single united people. There was no concept of Native American or Indian, really until the Europeans came and imposed it upon them. Native Americans didn't see themselves as Native Americans. They saw themselves as whatever particular piece of the Iroquois tribe or every piece of the Coast Salish tribe. There was no category of Indians, basically until Europeans come and they just can't make sense of the tremendous amount of ethnic diversity. And so they just, Indians, Native Americans. Subpoint E, we're going to talk for a moment about Native American religion, and I gotta tell you that this is really way too big of a topic to discuss fairly, because with a tremendous amount of diversity in governance, in beliefs, in geography, in just isolation, there's not really a thing that we could think of as Indian theology specifically. Each individual tribe would have its own understanding of deities and religion and theology. Still, though, we might be able to make some useful overall generalizations, because religious ceremonies in all of their varieties were directly related to farming and to hunting. Most Native Americans were animists, and animism is a particular type of religion that believes that every living thing, and even the inanimate things, have a spirit. And the specific practices are obviously going to vary, but most sought to try to understand the world by interpreting dreams and visions, and then conducting religious ceremonies to positively influence those spirits, to ensure things like successful hunts and good fortune. There were also people that seemed to have specific, special spiritual powers, and they held positions of respect and authority. A lot of people also believed that the soil productivity, so the ability to cultivate land and grow farming and agriculture, that soil productivity was closely related to women's life-giving abilities. So that continued fertility of humans related to continued fertility of the soil, and it requires these annual cleansing and renewal rites. Ceremonies performed by men before, during, and after a hunt, they appealed to the spiritual world. Things like protection, and also to request the peaceful passage of the animal spirit from the earth. Again, every tribe's going to have its own specific practices and theology. These are just broad categories that we might have to understand Native American religion. Roman numeral number 2. We'll talk about Indian concepts of freedom versus European concepts of freedom. This is a very Eric Foner topic, but let's begin in subpoint A of land and property. There was this complex network of trade that connected the vast Native American countryside. It brought foods and tools and natural resources and luxuries to all of the regions. The hunters and farmers, for instance, of the Great Plains region, they often met in these great trade fairs, bartering their respective products. Regional trade practices included the exchange of war captives, of slaves, or domestic gifts. And we know that the trade is extensive because we found things like stones and beads, which only come from one part of the country but appear in a different one. You might find seashells from the Pacific Northwest that appear in the American South. And long-distance trade usually is centered on acquiring precious objects, things like copper from the Great Lakes, or seashells from distant shores, or other high-prized luxury items like grizzly bear claws or eagle feathers. The chiefs, the successful hunters, the formidable rulers, they were usually the ones controlling the majority of locally produced and traded goods. But in Indian culture, there was this tradition of sharing and a desire to solidify the authority that required these wealthy leaders to go redistribute their belongings to the community and to family members. So there's no understanding of wealth the way a Westerner might look at it. It's an understanding of like having stuff to go share with everyone. Indians believed that land was a common resource. It wasn't an economic commodity. No one would own the earth. And so wealth mattered very little in Indian societies. Generosity was far more important. By contrast, Europeans don't really understand freedom of that at all. Europeans said that the notion of freedom seemed to be totally alien to Indian societies. They just don't seem to understand it, because European understandings of freedom were based on the ideas of personal independence and the ownership of private property. These ideas were foreign to Native Americans. They just had no way of understanding the way a European would think about it. More important for Native Americans than individual freedom were kinship ties, the things that bound people together. And Europeans, like, independence is more important. Europeans claimed that Indians weren't using their land. If they're not using their land, then they're not holding a title. They had no claim to hold it. Liberty in a European understanding came from knowing one's place in a hierarchical society, knowing where you fit into your structure of expectations of society, and fulfilling the duties appropriate to one's rank. If a person is a member of the nobility, they should act like noble people. That's what freedom is. They're free to live out their station. Europeans claimed that obedience to law was really the definition of freedom, because law was liberty's salvation. It held all of the miscreants in check. Numerous modern civil liberties, things like freedom of worship, they didn't exist. Europeans thought that Indians lacked true religion, and so there's no respect for Native American beliefs. Europeans believed that Indian men were weak and that Indian women were mistreated, and you find that there's really a sharp disconnect in the way the two sides will understand each other here at the moment of conflict. This story obviously is going to break out in a ton of different ways. It's fascinating, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.